Okay.
Wow.
Okay, so names are coming in. It looks like we're live on Facebook, but it's going to take a minute for the meeting to kick in on, it says we're live. Okay, so welcome to today's webinar, sponsored by the Thoreau Society. We will be discussing Thoreau and social distance, living deliberately in isolated time. Our guests today are Laura Walls. She's the biographer and author of Henry David Thoreau, A Life. Also joining us is Tom Montgomery Fate, author of Cabin Fever, and Ron Charles, a book critic at the Washington Post. And he recently wrote an article titled, "Walden may be the most famous act of social distancing. It's also a lesson in the importance of community." We're also joined by over 200 viewers globally, Thoreau Society members and others. And after today's webinar, we hope that you'll consider becoming a member of the Thoreau Society. I'll now hand things over to Laura.
Okay. Well, welcome all, and I'm honored that we're going first, and I cannot think of a more appropriate topic to begin the series with and for this moment in history. So this should be very interesting. And of course, it's a brand new topic in that there's no established thinking on this. So whatever we say is bound to bear an original relationship to the universe, as Emerson called for. So given that the topic is Thoreau and social distance, living deliberately in isolated times, there's a lot of words there. I thought maybe we should start with the basics. What do these words mean? The words I have in mind are particularly, what do you think Thoreau means by solitude? And how is that related to loneliness, as when Thoreau's neighbors asked him whether or not he didn't feel lonely out there? And of course, then there's the word isolation. How do those two words compare with being isolated, or if there's other words, or we get a cluster of, what's our baseline here? Who wants to start? Tom, why don't you start us?
Okay. Well, the mayor of Chicago today said that she wants to use the term physical distancing rather than social distancing, kind of hitting the idea that social distance or social isolation is also can be tied to the emotions or an emotional event rather than a physical event, i.e. that you can be lonely at a party or lonely with other people, et cetera, et cetera. So, or you can, online bullying, for example, is an attempt to socially isolate someone. So I see those distinctions. I think for Thoreau, I tie the word solitude to the word deliberate. And with deliberate, I go to the etymology and Libra, which is a scale, and that deliberation is a balancing of things. And so for him, I think it was a balancing of his physical isolation, his search for self-knowledge, et cetera, but a kind of ongoing balancing act.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Libra scales. Yeah, also liberty. A lot of good words in that one word. Ron, what are you thinking?
Loneliness for Thoreau clearly is associated, as for most of us, with despair. So it was something to be avoided. It was something negative. But isolation, solitude is a spiritual quality, a spiritual state, something to be celebrated, something to be pursued. And it doesn't have any negative connotations for him. And it doesn't have anything to do with loneliness. The two words are not in opposition to one another, are in opposition to one another. They're not synonyms. They're not two sides of the same coin. They're totally different concepts. When he talks about solitude, he's not even alone, because that's the state in which he is aware of the universe, aware of all the beings around him. And he makes the point that Tom just made, that lots of people are lonely when they're around people. It doesn't have anything to do with your proximity to others. He makes a funny remark about how we should each be about a mile apart, which is kind of extreme for these times, but certainly resonated with the kind of directions we're getting with the pandemic. But that doesn't mean that we have to be bereft.
Yeah, yeah. I've got a copy of Walden next to me, and I'm looking at, he speaks of being in company, even of the best, is soon wearisome and dissipating. I love to be alone. So, okay, that's the Thoreau we expect. And then he continues, I never found the companion that was so companionable as solitude. So it's like aloneness, maybe not loneliness, but aloneness is a gateway into this spiritual or deliberative state of solitude, which opens oddly or paradoxically to companionableness.
Right.
Yeah, a more conscious way of life.
And you hear this when you talk to people who are in religious retreats, who are members of orders. I mean, they're very familiar with this concept. They are alone, but they're not lonely. They're inspired.
Yeah, yeah. So going to Walden as a deliberate act, again, that word, to seek this state, which was not going to be permanent. I think this is something people tend to assume who don't know Thoreau very well, that he was a hermit, that this was a kind of life's choice that he never ended. But of course, we know that he returned to town after here's 2 months and 2 days, and lived in a very sociable household with the Emersons and then with his own family. So the notion of it as a kind of spiritual retreat, an excursion out into the state of solitude. I have to bring up something. It happened that I taught Walden soon after we at Notre Dame went on lockdown. All the students, it was spring break, all the students were away. They were told that they would never come back to campus this semester. And so I taught Walden in this very interesting circumstance when we were all acutely aware of solitude and isolation. And my students loved reading Walden and hated it. They loved it because they could feel the resonance. They hated it because they wanted to say, hey, look, Thoreau had a choice. His solitude was voluntary. He went because he wanted to. We didn't want this. We never chose this. This is something they forced us. We were coerced, and we hate it. We're unhappy. And so there was some real tension there. And I'm wondering how to think about that. Some thought that this just made all the difference in the world, that it sort of undermined any similarities with Thoreau's experiment. And others thought that no, there were other ways to think about this. I'm wondering what you both think. Does it make a difference if your solitude is voluntary or if it's coerced?
I'm not sure coerced is the word I would use, the situation we're in today, because I mean, part of it is the result of the fact of one of Thoreau's central ideas, which is we're all related, we're all connected. And so that's what's caused this biologically not being coerced. Let's see. Forced into isolation. I'm thinking of people like Malcolm X and Mandela imprisoned but also at a time, you know, suffering, but also were able perhaps to achieve Thoreau's idea of solitude in what they did with the written word and kind of self-discovery and self-recovery while imprisoned, which is, I don't say that lightly, but when you say the word coerced, I thought of imprisonment, opposed to the word experiment, which is an elective privilege, obviously. But I get it with the students. That's partly that's who our students are. They came through a different generation. Most my students weren't in didn't even know, weren't alive when 9/11 happened. And so, you know, they have a different cultural lens too, I think, to a degree. My mom died a month ago at 95, and that generation that lived through the Depression and World War II, and, you know, where the entire economy and the culture was turned upside down, I think may understand this or feel it differently than we do, or than our students do. Just a thought.
That's an interesting thought. Yeah, that it's a generational shift, or could be.
Yeah.
In which case it will, one of the things I've thought about is the way that this moment, I mean, to be older is to have a kind of perspective that you're introducing, Tom. To be younger, this is the world they know. And this is going to define how they know the world for the rest of their lives, which we hope will be long and prosperous. But, you know, they're so young.
Well, there's a spiraling uncertainty that is deeper and more confusing than anything they've encountered, and probably than many of us have encountered too. So it's warranted.
I agree there. Ron, what are your thoughts on this?
We read Walden on two levels at the same time, and if we're not aware of that, we get very irritated and confusing results. If we read it as a memoir, and we're constantly drawing lines between the text and Thoreau's biography, we find differences that make us think he's a hypocrite, and we get all worried about the fact that he's lying to us, which is a thoroughly respectable way to read the book, particularly if you're a biographer, which you are. But you can also read the text as a religious document, as an inspirational document, and then you're not worried about its correspondence to the details of his life. You're just worried about its power to inspire you. And what does it say to you? When I was teaching, I thought it was very curious and a perfectly legitimate thing for my students to make those connections with his life. But I also wanted them to set that aside at some point and just say, you know, what does the book do for me? How does it make me feel about being alone? How does it change my relationship to nature? How does it give me a sense of my potential? I've come to the end of this path, and I don't know how to stop. So I'll just stop speaking.
Well, that does follow into another side of it that my first thought when I started getting this response from my students was that what would it have meant for Thoreau to think of, well, this is voluntary, I can pick up and leave anytime. And thinking, well, that just felt wrong. Again, as a biographer, I thought, no, he couldn't. He was committed. And so then I thought, the solitude that he chose, once he chose it, was no longer really quite voluntary. He made a vow. It was, in that sense, as you say, Ron, a religious kind of experiment or choice. Oddly enough, he made a vow or a choice not to have a choice. In other words, if he'd said, oh, you know, forget it, I'm going to go back to town, and he would have been a failure in his own eyes, but also the eyes of his friends. And I think it would have been catastrophic for everything he stood for. I mean, I even can't even imagine that. So I guess the sort of next step of my thoughts there is the police are not literally at our doors, right? I mean, we do have literally the choice to leave or to disobey, or to, as many, at least in my part of the world, are disregarding the lockdown or quarantine orders. So are we not also doing something similar in making a kind of avowal? But it's not quite the same as Thoreau. When we agree to leave when we agree then not to leave the house, when we agree to these conditions, to what or whom are we making our vows?
When we agree not to leave, are you saying?
Yeah, I mean, again, there's a coercive, or to use the word that of course you didn't much like, but yeah, there's a kind of forced quality to what we're undergoing now. But there's also a sense that, you know, one could in fact leave. One could say, I'm not going to do this. I'm just not. And once you do that, you've broken a kind of vow that we've been asked to take. There are literally no guards at my door,
Right.
and yet I'm here in the house, and so forth.
But that's based on
It
your,
makes me think about the society that we're trying to build when we come to this agreement for each other.
Right.
you're staying home because you have a sense of your responsibility to that society, to other people, some you know, most you don't know, but you still feel that sense of responsibility. I think Thoreau's sense of responsibility was not to society, but to himself. So it is different. And as any undergraduate will point out to you, he cheated all the time. I mean, he was, you know, he was not a good social isolator.
Yeah, this is true.
It's not in Walden, but it's certainly in your book that he was going into town, and, you know, as anyone will tell you, his mom was doing his laundry. Like, we have to hear about that every single time we talk about Walden.
As Rebecca Solnit pointed out, so which male author exactly did do his laundry, pray tell? Yeah.
Well, he still had a great deal of individual freedom. And I was thinking about this while preparing for this, was the folks with the automatic weapons at the State House in East Lansing, Michigan, want individual freedom from these laws that are being imposed on. They feel like they're being coerced. Well, Thoreau also focused very much on the individual, but it was on self-formation or individual reformation. And I think that was supposed to lead from that individual responsibility to a social responsibility, so that they converge at some point. And so that's why I can imagine some of them saying, somehow pilfering Thoreau into their reasons for being on the State House steps. But very different kinds of freedom and a progressive kind of thinking too, that are just not the same thing.
Yeah, that leads to, I mean, there's a couple directions. One is the fact that Thoreau was, in fact, again, as a biographer, a surprisingly, maybe not the most sociable being, sure, but surprisingly social in his connections. And of course, he tells us that he had visitors at the pond. And he says, it's not important that I went into town. I'm not going to talk to you about that, because again, the autobiography wasn't the point of Walden, it was the spiritual state. So the Thoreau who, I don't know, the Thoreau who opens himself to visitors, or who opens himself to going to town, to going to his family, does that intensify or deepen his commitment to solitude rather than break it? Is there, I guess, Tom, going back to what you said about balance, the sense that it is a responsibility, that one weighs it in a deeper level than just literally the door, whether I go out the door or not. But you're thinking about social contact as part of life too. How do we maintain it? I mean, we're doing that right now through Zoom, of course. Yeah.
Well, I mean, thinking about that aspect in the scope of his entire life, though. And, he lived on the house in Main Street the last 9 years of his life, and from the attic where he stayed, he could look 500 yards down the hill to the Sudbury River, where he had a boat, and he would wander, reflecting and writing and making observations. And he could look, I call that the artist. He could look 500 yards in the other direction and see the Fitchburg Railroad Station, where he took runaway slaves and set them on the underground to Canada. So that juxtaposition of the artist and the activist, I think, was always part of him. Maybe it was formulated more so during that extended isolation at Walden, but I think it was always a part of him. And I see it also in the writer, who is constantly looking in at the capital I and out with the eyes, in at the self and out at the world. And Thoreau models that better than most.
Yeah. Ron, I saw you nodding there.
Yeah, because when my students would accuse Thoreau of being selfish and self-absorbed, I would remind him, that he was involved in the abolition movement, that he was taking a lot more risks than most of us ever do for any social cause we believe in. And what do? We click on a like in Facebook or something, and that's our social activism. I'm speaking broadly here, but and also the act of writing itself is a social commitment to others. If you write one of the greatest, most inspiring books of the 19th century, that's very, very significant. That's more than most of us will ever do for our society, and that shouldn't be just discounted because we find his social criticism of us implicitly grating.
I think that's really important. And, his friends certainly understood that the point of the Walden cabin, in practical terms, was a writing workshop. He was there to write a book, and, you can't write a book, 24/7. You've got to have some relief. And so get out, whether it's, to take a walk or out to the pond, or into town to shake yourself loose of your thoughts for a moment. And he writes about going to the village and seeing it in this wonderfully sort of distanced way, right? Like he was a kind of, visitor from Mars, saying, look at all these odd inhabitants here. Yeah. So that sense that solitude enabled him to see things that he couldn't have seen otherwise. And I think maybe that's some part of our experience now too. As I'm concentrating, I'm just seeing a few chat comments fly past the screen, and I can't focus on them particularly.
Yeah, hard, isn't it?
But I'm noticing, people are commenting on the kind of conscious intensity that this can bring to Common X. I know I'm very much more aware of common things that, I choose to do or choose to not do, or maybe can't do. And that kind of visibility is maybe part of it. Anyone want to, what can it enable us to see this state of being that we're undergoing now, that we haven't thought to notice before, that we haven't seen before?
Well, I was thinking about, I'm not aligning perfectly here, but I was thinking about you're talking about seeing, and Thoreau talks about this all the time, about how we see. And again, I'm always kind of use the artist activist balance to think about Thoreau. And I always think of this, seeing the world versus saving the world. And I think for Thoreau, seeing the world preceded that and was a means of saving the world, or his art was a means of being an activist. So like Ron said, his writing was a form of activism too, not just the Underground Railroad or defending John Brown, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Weirdly, well, not weirdly, I don't know why I introduced myself that way. I'm a Christian Scientist, so my faith comes out of this same period. And we believe that seeing the world is part of reforming it. Seeing the world clearly is the act of redeeming it. So when I read Walden, I very much resonated with that idea that Tom's talking about. Seeing is not passive. It's prayer. It's active. It's transformative.
Yeah, attention. It's a going out into. It's an extension of oneself, out of oneself into the world. I think that becomes a condition of seeing this. Well, the companionship of solitude. I mean, if you're bubbled up, yeah, you can wall yourself off. But Thoreau is specifically trying to do the opposite, to extend himself through attention, which is the first act in writing. Yeah, yeah, I like that a lot. That helps because that sense that you can pay more attention to what you must do instead of, or what you feel is important to you to do, instead of the kind of rat race, like, watching the clock constantly thinking, oh, there's these 14 things that have to be done by 5 o'clock, or the kind of continual. And of course, our cell phones, we still have them with us, and there's a kind of, buzzing in thing that we keep doing with our socialized part of our distancing. That again, thinking about my students, they were very aware that they were very tied to their screens. And they thought it would be really cool to be like Thoreau and not have to be tied to a screen.
Yeah.
Just put the devices away, turn them off, walk away. Yeah.
But I wonder if students can imagine what it was like to have a rich correspondence life, to be constantly writing letters and receiving letters.
Mm-hmm.
They don't even know how to address an envelope, speaking only of my own daughter. But Thoreau, talks about walking to the post office with letters in Walden. They had a kind of social media that they thought was very advanced. I mean, it was remarkable to them that letters could travel across the state and even deep into the country by railroad.
Mm-hmm.
And in a few decades, they'll look back at our social media and it will look very primitive to them too. So I think the idea that there was no social media of the time is not entirely accurate.
But
Yeah.
but letter writing, or writing in general, this is important to me, is also a reflective act. And I think the kind of writing we're doing now on Snapchat and texting is reactive. And they're two really different ways of thinking. And reflective thinking, if all of you have been teachers, know that's a hard thing to teach. It's gotten harder to teach over my 30 years in the classroom, or 35 years. That's a challenge. And then the other thing I thought of was the students who, say that Thoreau, they wish they lived when there were no cell phones, etc. But there's an incredible book by Jean Twenge, I think it was 2017, called iGen. And in it, she has massive research that shows that teenagers are more depressed and have higher levels of anxiety than ever in history. And she ties it all to the cell phone. I think it's 2015 when something like 2/3 of teenagers had it. So, and now, we're trapped, and those things, like we're on Zoom right now, those are our lifelines out. And so there's a great irony in that, that the cell phone has done a lot of damage and a lot of wonderful things. But it's important for students to think about both sides of that,
Yeah, and I think what this will look like, I mean, clearly this is not going to go back to the era of handwriting correspondence. And so, again, this is a massive social experiment. This is doing something to us that we're experiencing it even as we're inventing or reinventing how to connect with each other through these means, through cell phones, through Snapchat and all the other devices. So some people ask, would Thoreau have emailed, would Thoreau have Zoomed? And I don't know, would he have Zoomed? I suspect he would have been guardedly interested in it and probably thinking about it rather
safe
carefully.
way to travel for him.
Yeah, right. Again, as long as you're using it, not letting it use you, you would
I have traveled much on Zoom, he would say.
I have one final question that I'm, it's of course one of the things that we were especially saying early on in the pandemic of states of isolation were that the skies were blue for the first time or over cities. And even here in northern Indiana, there was an intensity of color in the sky that all of us were marveling at. We'd never seen it like that before. That nature, animals were coming out of hiding, that birds seemed to sing louder. There were coyotes in the streets of urban areas. So there is a connection with nature here that I think is worth thinking about in terms of Thoreau's nature versus ours. So Walden argues on every page that removing oneself from human society opens us up to the society of nature, this companionship. Almost at random, I picked a quote. The indescribable innocence and beneficence of nature, of sun and wind and rain, of summer and winter, such health, such cheer they afford forever. So again, thinking about young people today, they might look at this, some of them do, and say, well, that might have worked in 1845, but it doesn't work so well today. When, you know, our nature is not pure and untouched, it's polluted and it's damaged and states of ecological collapse. And when you go to nature, what you think about is what you're losing, about what you've lost. Solitude in nature might open yourself up not to deeper healing, which Thoreau is so certain it will, but could it open us up to a deeper feeling of pain? Is that necessarily a bad thing? Has nature changed in ways that make this less available, that make Walden more distant from us today?
Well, he lived on a wood-lot, and the train came by 20 times a day. He was not in some pristine wilderness, and he was near the hottest technology at the time.
Exactly.
And so in terms of what he would, well, I think what he'd tell us, I mean, I think his message is the same, which is kind of individual responsibility. Your ability to respond comes from learning how to see and how to know yourself, and that will lead you to connection and relationship, which will lead you to a broader responsibility, a social responsibility. Kind of convenient, but.
I think that's, yeah, I like that thought. We're getting photo bombed from my cat, so Zoom bombed, so try to keep the distraction away. Ron, did you have anything to add to that?
I was going to make the same point, not as eloquently as Tom did, that Thoreau was worried about the destruction of his environment there with the train coming through, and he complains about the telegraph and the distraction of all these telegraphs. And I'm not going to get the cities right, but he says, so what if we can send a message from Boston to, I don't know what city he said, some other city far away. What if you have nothing to say to that city? Are you just going to just say stuff, basically? Which of course is where we are now, just saying stuff, as Tom was saying, with the great distraction of social media, without the sort of contemplation that written correspondence allowed us. But of course, he was at the beginning of an environmental movement, and we're still in, right? I mean, we're still making the same arguments. We have the same concerns. It's just much more extreme now. But aren't you kind of encouraged by how quickly nature came back? I mean, it's just been a couple months, and already you see such dramatic. Gives me hope. It makes me think that maybe things haven't gone too far. Maybe we can get out of this before we completely ruin the earth. It didn't take that much time for things to look better, and I suppose be better.
It's like a kind of life force. Just, I mean, we call it spring, of course. It coincided with spring, but even so, it seemed something beyond just that. Maybe it was partly our awareness too.
Right.
In solitary states, we are seeing what was hidden before. My neighbors all tell me the birds have never sung so loud, and I listen and I'm thinking, no, actually, they sing like this every spring. What's changed is your ability to pay attention, to hear them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The flowering trees here in DC are just spectacular. I've never seen them like this before, but that's because I never walked 3 times a day before. You know, I was always inside or I was in the office. I'm sure they were blooming every spring.
Mhm.
Well, I'm aware of the time and thinking that we should probably wrap up this portion of our webinar. I'm wondering if you both have sort of last thought, what Thoreau might say to us today, especially to those of us who live in his nation in the United States. I mean, would he find any notable similarities between our moment of crisis, our moment of technological confusion, and his own? These are always hard. I don't like to imagine channeling Thoreau. Yes, if he were here, he would say the following, but still, it's a fun experiment to play with. Any thoughts on that? A spectral appearance from Henry from afar.
Well, for me, kind of the same thing. I mean, I think he's pretty consistent, which again is self-knowledge. Know yourself. From that, learn how you're connected, that the human being is an animal and part of things, part of the web of creation, and that will lead you to a greater sense of your ability to respond, or your responsibility to the wider world. I mean, I know that's very basic, but I think it comes through consistently in all of his work, particularly in the last 15 years or so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Ron?
I'm struck by this question from the chapter Solitude. What sort of space is it that separates a man from his fellows and makes him solitary?
Mm-hmm.
That's what we should take this moment to think about. This moment, I mean this era. What sort of space is it that separates us? It's not physical space, as we know, because we can be lonely in crowds and we can have a sense of unity alone. So many of my colleagues are not alone now. They're crowded in pretty small DC homes or apartments with their babies and their children and their spouses. And so a conversation about solitude strikes them as completely irrelevant to their experience right now.
That's a good note to close this on, because it opens up to the paradox that is exactly the Thoreau who was at Walden because he was trying to escape a crowded home, right? Very busy home life with lots of people living right on top of each other, lots of responsibilities to each other. And so that excursion to Walden to create a space of solitude in order to see this kind of outward extension and attention, knowing that it would be temporary, that that would lead to a return to the kind of, we would like to think, and I call it Walden on Main, that he did see a home environment that was enhanced rather than apart from or diminished by his experience. That he understood his neighbors and family members and his relationships to them. And of course, it was a life project, a work in progress, that he continued to advance in the time after he returned from Malden, less solitary than perhaps he wanted to be. I think that's a good, we're not solitary here at all. I'm watching the participant numbers climb and the question and chat comments climb. And so I think maybe now it's time for Mike to let us know what people would like to ask.
Oh, well, one interesting comment that came through that I found interesting, and it's a quote from Paul Tillich, and it says, "Our language has wisely sensed the two sides of being alone. It has created the word loneliness to express the pain of being alone, and it has created the word solitude to express the glory of being alone." Those words seem so relevant to Thoreau as well.
It does. That's very good. Very appropriate.
Another question that has come up from more than one person They're asking the panelist, um, if, what about thinking about Walden as explicitly a social project? Could we also say he was redefining the social? And if so, what lesson might that offer us?
I like the thought of redefining the social, because that makes me immediately think of the chapter that most readers tend to skip over, which is Former Inhabitants, the chapter that Elise Lemire focused on, and has become a real kind of life's work, life's project to identify who they were. So society might not just be, the people who live around us, in the same temporality we are, but the people who came before us and those who will come after us.
And well, maybe one question to end on. This is something that's probably on a lot of our minds as we social distance. How can we take advantage of our current solitude to live more deliberately?
Mm-hmm.
It's really hard. I feel like I'm working twice as much at quarter speed. I just feel it's really grinding.
Yeah.
I'm grateful to have a job. I want to start there. And I know a lot of people, millions of people don't. So I don't mean to be smug about my little problem, but a lot of people that I know who have jobs are really feeling worn down by it. And I mean, just the hour I took preparing for this chat and rereading Solitude and Visitors, the chapters in Walden, was really restorative. I mean, I've read the book many times, but it was just incredibly inspiring. And I guess I would just plead with people to make a little time to read, something demanding and inspiring and thoughtful, that can really recharge you in a way that you'll be surprised by if you can find the space and the time.
I like that.
I think it might be an opportunity also, like what I mentioned earlier, to be aware of how we think a little bit in terms of this is a chance to be a little bit more reflective rather than reactive, a chance to restore relationships in ways where we don't give those relationships the time they need, not just the people that you're quarantined with, but like Ron talked about, writing letters, those kinds of things. It's a time for restoration. It could be if we can calm our anxiety enough. And then, of course, supporting all the folks that are on the front lines is, I think, sending them letters and food and things like that. It makes them feel good, but it makes us feel good too, like we're connected. So, yeah,
I think part of that is the kind of conscious choice you have to make. Immediately, the first person you need to call or call on to help, whatever choice you want to make to fulfill that. And suddenly you're aware, acutely aware, you take for granted no longer the people that you need to call on to help you do the things that you need to do. You can't just go do them yourself or assume that everything's going to happen in the way that it used to. So suddenly old friends that you thought, well, I'll see them. You don't know when. You need to reach out to them. Suddenly you're feeling a need to connect and not take for granted that they'll be there, or the person who can bring mail. All of people who are on the front lines as healthcare workers and service workers. I've never thought so carefully and so much about who they are and the lives that they need to be living so that I can be here, obeying the lockdown orders and my university's request to stay off campus, right? So that's another side of it. And yes, the people that you live with and are surrounded by and maybe would like to step out with a little bit and be apart from, carving out that time can be as simple as closing a door for half an hour anything. I'm going to meditate, I'm going to draw, I'm going to play a musical instrument, I'm going to read. But I think we've got to find ways to make that connection to the inner self in order to be better people to each other when we step out of that inner self back out into the connected world. Otherwise, we weigh ourselves down with our own fears too much.
Well said.
Yeah. Well, this has been a good start.
Yes. Well, thank you, panelists, for joining us today. And that was a enlightening conversation. And also to all of our attendees who have joined us from across the world to listen to today's conversation.
Yeah,
And
thank you all. Yeah.
It was a great
Thank
honor
you.
to be involved. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mike, for pulling us together, for reaching out and getting us all to Zoom simultaneously. And thank you, Ron, and thank you, Tom. By the way, looking up your works online, many of them are available online. I spent the afternoon yesterday reading some absolutely wonderful essays from you both, and it was a treat. I was out listening to the birds. It was a lovely day, and I thought Thoreau was alive and well. All around.
Thank you.
All right. Wow, I'm getting a questionnaire.
Yes, I got a questionnaire. Did I enjoy today's? I did enjoy it. Yes.
I did. Yes.
I really enjoyed it.
Okay.
All right. Thank you all so much.
thank you.
Are we offline or how are we?
We're going to end now.
Okay.
Yeah.
When you get a
Take care.
questionnaire, it has a certain, distracting quality. Thank you all.
Yeah. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.